I'm Ronald James. Welcome to Bigger Questions. For thousands of years, humans have looked up at the cosmos and wondered, why are we here? Now, the trend is to look in the other direction. But there's nothing new about that. We indeed live in interesting times. Here we sit, taking another look at some of the oldest teachings about our existence. We're living in a matrix. An illusion? Yeah, they've been saying that for a long time. Long enough for more brilliant minds to dismiss the entire concept. But now, we're starting to prove it scientifically. How cool is that? What is the true nature of reality? And what is the connection between consciousness and spirit? What kind of a world will we live in when there is a total fusion of science and religion? The Bigger Questions series addresses these most fundamental of questions with the help and guidance of some of the scientific community's most brilliant thinkers. From the realms of quantum physics, parapsychology, psychology, mathematics, astronomy, and spiritual studies, we're asking bigger questions.
I'll tell you what I think is wrong with these very abstract physical theories about the ultimate nature of reality. And that is they leave out some of the most important empirical data around, namely the data of parapsychology. The fact that we now have thousands of laboratory studies demonstrating things like telepathy and clairvoyance and precognition. And these physical theories have no explanation for those things. Now that simply tells me these physical theories may be very interesting, but there's a glaring hole in them. So when people start working with them as if they're the complete truth about reality, I just say, something's left out, okay? Remember, it's specialized, that's nice, but don't get carried away by your ideas. There is a psychological principle that I like to call the principle of universal rationalization. In retrospect, when you've seen some things in retrospect, you can always make up some plausible theory that seems to explain what happened. And that doesn't mean in the slightest that it's actually true. It just means it's plausible because the human mind is so constructed. That's why science requires you to not only come up with a theory that plausibly explains what we already know, but then makes predictions about the unknown that you can test. If you do the test and it doesn't work out, your theory's no good. It doesn't matter how elegant, mathematical, fashionable it is, it's no good. It doesn't account for actual reality.
I think if you're going to make progress in this field, particularly the field of psi phenomena, where the concepts of reality become very nebulous, it's essential that we clearly define what we mean and not just use nebulous language or say, well, this is like that. Well, how is it like that specifically? And is it meant to be a scientific theory or a model or just a metaphor?
Parapsychology. I think anyone who reads Dean Radin's book, The Conscious Universe, from cover to cover and has integrity can no longer doubt that psychic phenomena truly are a part of the human armamentarium. They are just part of our expression, and boom, that's it. I mean, it's there. He's done a masterful job. I really applaud him for what he has done, because it is a question of integrity. The fact is that give the general scientist they don't have direct experience, it's really hard for them, because they feel they're sort of unconsciously like priests defending the church of science. Well, it's too bad, but in fact, it says that they really should get out of their box perhaps and start experiencing, because it's there and it's been done, and it's only a question of quibbling about details. Now, I don't think it is any longer an issue as far as I'm concerned if there is integrity, because it's been done. He's done it.
there's much, much less skepticism than there has ever been. Actually, in my book, The Conscious Universe, I go into great gory detail over what is the status of the evidence for psychic phenomena, the scientific status. And I think a case can be made now that at absolute minimum, we can demonstrate to very high levels of scientific confidence that there's something worth studying. And that's quite different than saying we've proven that psychic abilities exist. But the reason I said that at absolute minimum is because even skeptics now, lifelong, harshest skeptics you can imagine, if they honestly look at the data and spend the time to become informed about the nature of the data, they all go away with the same feeling, which is, I don't know what's going on, I don't have a plausible alternative explanation, all of the usual skeptical responses and critiques have been addressed in great gory detail, and what's left over is this high confidence that something interesting is going on. That's the minimum. So if we go up from the minimum, I think what we see is an enormous amount of data which is confirming what people talk about in their daily life. So if somebody has a precognitive dream, for example, there's now 110 years of research, controlled research in the laboratory looking at precognition. Could it be real? Could what people describe actually be what's going on? And the answer is, again, to very high levels of confidence, yes. We know that sometimes precognition actually occurs. Now, if you project that into the world, let's say the world is full of 800 units of reports of psychic phenomena, whatever a unit is. And now we look at the laboratory, and we see in the laboratory the kinds of effects that we generally deal with. So out of this grand scope of 800 reports that happen all the time, we can say with some confidence that something like 8 of those reports are probably genuine. And 72 of the reports were mistakes or coincidences or something else. So in other words, the large majority of what passes for psychic phenomena probably is not, and can be explained reasonably well by more prosaic explanations like selective memory and so on, but not all. And we know that it's not all because of the controlled work in the laboratory, and that means that while we can't say in any given anecdote whether that's a real one or not, and of course there are probably many that are mixtures of real psychic stuff and some stories or elaborations mixed in, but we know that in principle it's possible. So I think the reason that that skepticism remains is primarily due to one reason, which is ignorance. There's plenty of data out there and plenty of publications and plenty of stuff that can be looked at. And in my experience in dealing with many skeptical sciences from many different disciplines, we find again and again that if somebody actually takes the time to sit down and pay enough attention to it, they go away, at minimum, convinced that there's something interesting going on.
There's been a grassroots movement growing for 20, 30, 40 years, really since the 60s, which has suddenly started, historically suddenly, really valuing consciousness and the exploration of consciousness. And that's manifesting in the general public as a growing widespread interest in self-understanding, dealing with the various things that stop us being fully human. Science at the moment is not following that, but I think as that groundswell grows, there's going to be more and more interest in consciousness, and I think a few scientists are beginning to look at what is consciousness. And I think the question that's going to start emerging in the 21st century is really the question of what's it all about, what are human beings doing here, what do we really want? They're going to be those real fundamental, deep philosophical questions which are going to open up the whole issue of consciousness. And the further out we go in terms of robotics and genetic engineering and all the other technological advances, the internet and all that stuff, I think all of that's going to push us back to that question.
One of the things I've realized is that we've been so culturally conditioned. Here I thought we were in an age of enlightenment and that we would have, through the academic system, the ability to do important research at the frontiers of science, and that science would progress more and more to a very kind of coherent model for what reality is. And in fact, what's happening is now the walls are falling down, and that the house of physics is in need for big house cleaning. The physicists themselves realize this. They have a fear of all of their, many of their beliefs falling apart, because when you bring in consciousness into physics, the physicists are very disturbed. It means that there's no normal causality. Now, what was an example of this? I talked about an experiment I did once when I was in graduate school, and it was to observe a predicted effect that would reveal the presence of ice crystals in the Venus clouds. And I did the work at a telescope, and the idea was to see whether or not my model was borne out in the light curves and the polarization and so forth of planet Venus. And I found the effect. And so I went kind of eureka. I published the results, but I was cautious. I said, this awaits replication. Well, what I think really happened was that I, through my consciousness, influenced the electronics to create the effect that I wanted. And I think that now there are more and more experiments that are beginning to reveal that. And that's very disturbing to many physicists. There was one physicist at Princeton, I'll never forget this, because I was on the faculty there, and there were 40 of us, and it was all male, and 6 of us were Nobel laureates, and one of the Nobel laureates, Philip Anderson, basically said about Robert John's work at Princeton in using random event generators to respond to the intention of operators, in other words, psychokinesis, that if this is true, if we can influence the electronics of a device that's measuring what we're trying to measure as objective reality, then the laws of physics are going to have to be suspended. But then Anderson went on to say that the laws of physics can't be suspended, therefore John must be wrong. Well, now I've gotten to the point where there are just too many anomalies. So what's in fact happening is that this notion of a precise objective science, where you have the objective observer and the observed, and the interaction is simply measuring this reality in the Newtonian sense, that's no longer true. That's bad news for mainstream materialistic science. It's good news for the science of consciousness, because I'm sure we'll figure out ways about how this dance of interaction occurs, how human intention, for example, can actually create results in the material world and act back on the humans. We can find that out because we can observe physical space and then therefore reveal the properties of this unseen, unmanifest reality, this ether, this implicate order that lies underneath what we observe.
I was clinically dead 10 years ago. I had a bone marrow transplant and was clinically dead and resuscitated 3 times. And I talk a lot about that experience. And people will explain it to me in terms of quantum theory, and I even took 10 principles of quantum theory and looked at that. I think that's one explanatory model, but I think it's inadequate too. I think that there's much, much more to this. Speaking as a Hawaiian who was raised to say that everything is connected, that reality is all around us, that we are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spirits having a brief human experience. And you'll find a lot of theorists saying that type of thing in different ways. But quantum theory, and trying to explain it in quantum ways, is again the brain. That appeals to these brilliant brains and who play with it almost as a great unsolvable puzzle. When Einstein talked about ghostly action at a distance and photons accelerating out into space, forever to be connected. And poor Albert saying, this can't work, this won't work, and then it got all sort of discombobulated about this whole problem. And then we find out that he didn't have to be, that we are all indeed connected. Now that got into the New Age media, and we started talking about your vibes and where's your head at and all of that, but it's much more profound than that. So I don't mean to be arrogant about this. Hawaiians call that ha-ha-ha. But quantum science appeals because it's so mysterious. And we talk about the holographic universe, and every one of cell of my body is the cell of everyone. But the ancients have always said that we are indeed all of everyone. Our ancestors are with us. always, and they talk about a word called Pono. And I would wager all my money as a scientist and all my academic degrees that when we talk to scientists, as brilliant as they are, ask them this: do you know about the oceanic approach to this? Or are you using a hare brain instead of a tortoise mind? Tortoise mind means let it come to you. And if you let it come in the oceanic model, we don't have to think either or, we think and. We always think in terms of a word called Pono, which means aligned rightly. And that means that our Aumakua, our ancestors, our Makua, our parents, our Keiki, our children, all of us are one. Death is irrelevant. One of my Kapuna, one of my teachers the other day said, dying's a pain in the okoli, that's the rear end. But death is irrelevant, meaning it's a passing on, it's important, but it's irrelevant in the sense of our great fear of it, is really without basis, because reality is much, much more than that. My colleagues, Dr. Gary Schwartz and Linda Russick, have talked about what they call the living energy universe, that with what they call systemic memory, that memory exists for all of us. We can tap into it. We researched heart transplant patients who received the memories of their donor. That was shocking enough, but get ready, we call this chicken skin in Hawaii or goosebumps. We're finding heart transplant recipients not only reporting the memories and having personality traits of their donors, but reporting things that their donors felt that the donor families were unaware of. Meaning that now they're tuning into things that the donor seems to be communicating to them after death.
Only consciousness. There's only this one consciousness. All objects, subjects, everything is manifestation of this consciousness. So when you say individual consciousness, it's really an identity. This big, the whole, thinks or is illuded to think. It's an illusory thinking that makes it appear to itself that it is bound, it is small, it is individualized. It is consciousness itself is deluded into thinking that. Not deluded by ordinary delusional kind of situation, but there is a mechanism for this. Mechanism is called conditioning. So consciousness is free if we get over these aspects which binds us. What binds consciousness? What binds consciousness is the tendency of the mechanism of the brain to always present its memory whenever a learned stimulus is presented to it. The learned stimulus is played, but the memory also plays. And it's that memory play that produces a modification of the probability calculus of quantum mechanics. These modified probabilities are favorable to past responses only. So the brain develops a habit of responding the way it responded before. And that is what reflects as a conditioned habit pattern. Once this conditioned habit pattern has developed, we identify more and more with this conditioned habit pattern. We meaning consciousness, the whole. So the whole is identifying with a particular subclass of itself, in its behavior. And that is what produces the individuality. It's not a bad thing, because by necessity of structure, the individual body already is individual. The body has an individuality. So once this body's individuality gets into a mental individuality through the mechanism of the brain, then there is also a mind that is individual. And so there is a reference point now that can be given. There is an individuality and one can refer to itself. Otherwise, one would not have any reference point to carry on even a conversation, let alone relationship. So the universe becomes a little more subtle this way. Otherwise, the universe would not have all the subtleties that individualities, individual identities produce. But the identities are all identities of the whole. They are not separate from the whole. We are not separate things and then we are connected to the whole. It's not like that. The whole is expressing itself in these various identities. Everything is always the whole. Notice the similarity of the holographic paradigm in this way. That is the real meaning of the holographic paradigm. It's not a physical hologram. It's hologram in the sense that everything is really ultimately does have that whole. It's always the whole. It never is without the whole. It's not part of a hologram where the wholeness is very restricted, limited. You know, hologram, the part of a hologram is only only partly a whole. It's not really a whole because you cannot recapture the picture in its all glory. It compromise. You don't get the resolution very well if you take a small part of a hologram. But here, really, even the smallest part has all the potential of the entire consciousness. Every individual, every ego can eventually access everything that there is to access. So it's a much greater glory than even a hologram's glory.
There is excellent evidence that the human mind can precognize the future. That is, you can do an experiment like show a person a deck of cards and say, see this deck of cards? After you leave, I'm going to shuffle it 100 times. Would you please write down now what the order will be when I'm finished? And people are not wildly successful in that, but they're successful enough of the time to show that the mind's somehow getting information about the future. Now, how in the world could they get information about the future when the future is randomly determined? Yet it happens, and that just shows me that our understanding of time is grossly inadequate at this point. We think we know something about it. There's very mysterious stuff about time. And it's hard to accept that data. Okay, I know that I knew about this empirical data. I'd read the experiments for many, many years, talked about it as a proven fact, but when I had precognition happen in my own laboratory experiments, I was shocked because I didn't actually think that stuff was real, but here it was in my own data in very large amounts. I could no longer ignore it. Something's funny about time. You know, I think there's some way in which the future is at least partially determined. And yet it's also quite clear to me that we have free will. Because after all, if we didn't have free will, there wouldn't be any fun, right? I'd be giving you this answer because I had no choice about it. So my motto is be kind to determinists. They can't help what they think and say.
We did work for 20 years at Stanford Research Institute investigating parapsychology, and in particular a kind of psychic functioning called remote viewing, where people in the laboratory are able to describe and experience what's going on in a distant place or even at a future time. What we found out is that moving people further and further away from the laboratory, further and further in the future, did not interfere with a person's ability to describe what's going on in the distant place or what will happen in the future. We had psychics working with us who were able to learn to focus their attention on either geographical coordinates of a distant place or a distant place through use of a picture of somebody who is at that faraway location. And it didn't matter whether it was across the street or in the far reaches of Siberia. People are able to describe and draw, often with very great accuracy, what's going on at that distant place. One of our celebrated occurrences was an experiment with Pat Price, who's a retired policeman. We were asked to describe what was going on at a Soviet laboratory in Soviet Siberia, and he was able to draw the outside of a building which included a giant gantry crane rolling back and forth over the building. His drawing was verified by satellite photography, and he went on to say that inside the building the Russians were constructing a giant steel sphere, some kind of containment vessel, and it turned out the containment vessel that policeman Price saw was part of a particle beam weapon to shoot down the satellites that were taking the very pictures that we used to confirm the experiment. So this was a case where we were able to eventually publish our data in the most prestigious magazines in the world, Nature magazine, the American Academy of Science, and we then had a congressional investigation because the data was so good that Congress wanted to make sure there was not some kind of national security leak that allowed a policeman in California to know the intimate workings of the far Soviet Union. And of course there was no leakage.
Let's try to separate out what can be scientifically or what could be testable and what can form a useful hypothesis that can perhaps explain things that cannot be explained by conventional physics. For example, the spirit hypothesis can be useful in explaining such things as reincarnation, as Dr. Jan Stevenson has shown in his books and research. It could be used to explain, for example, or counter out-of-body experiences. Again, verifiable out-of-body experiences where the recipient is able to ascertain information about some remote location that could not normally, that could not be known by normal means. And similarly with near-death experiences where the experiencer is able to meet some people on the other side that he was not informed had died. So that those would be, that would be evidence to suggest the existence of the spirit hypothesis and the possible survival of consciousness beyond bodily death.
If you look at the history of parapsychology, most of the early history, the first 50 to 75 years, was involved in proof-oriented research to try to prove that telepathy exists, or prove that clairvoyance exists, that kind of thing. And that changed about 25 years ago into process-oriented research, in which we're no longer interested in trying to prove it because there's a gigantic amount of empirical data that already proves it, that there's something interesting. And we're interested in the process. What are the conditions under which we can make somebody do a better result in the laboratory? And what difference does it make what somebody's personality is, or their height, or their weight, or their sex, or something of that sort? That's how we begin to piece apart what matters and how to explain these things. So the vast majority of process-oriented research has dealt with conscious experience. Like telepathy, for example. You do a telepathy test and you ask somebody to speak out loud what their experience is. And then you'd use that as part of your raw data to analyze how good the person did. Well, it's also true that there are unconscious responses to psychic impressions that manifest as changes in heart rate or skin conductance and that sort of thing, which people are not aware of. And it turns out that those effects are much, much stronger. And the reason they're stronger is probably due to the fact that if somebody is responding unconsciously to something, they don't have a chance to filter out all of the things that they would otherwise filter out. So just to give a quick example, if, let's say, in a few minutes, I sit somebody down, I measure their skin conductance. In a few minutes, I'm going to show them a picture that might have strong sexual content. Well, if I was to ask them to report what their experience was consciously about this precognition, they might suppress it, because in fact they might get something that has to do with erotic content, but they wouldn't want to report it because they'd be embarrassed to. So you can run experiments like this, and actually you can shoot yourself in the foot by doing experiments where you're dealing now with many layers of psychological defense mechanisms. But you don't see that at all if you're dealing directly with things like heart rate and blood pressure and skin conductance and so on. So by moving away from conscious responses to unconscious responses, we're finding more and more robust ways of looking at the phenomena. So what I'm working on now, and have been for the last couple of years, is finding ways of increasing the effect sizes in unselected people. And the next step is then finding it in selected people. So we know, for example, that since we're dealing with something like talent, that if we have a room full of 100 people and they all give them a test on presentiment, which is looking at unconscious responses to future events, that something like 4 or 5 of those people will do exceptionally well. So now we pull out those 4 or 5 people and we start doing new experiments on them to try to understand, because they give such a good response, how is it that you can respond to something which is coming up in your future? Where is that information? How did it get in your head? Does it light up a certain part of your brain before some other part of your brain, and so on? There are lots of questions like that you can ask, which try to piece apart how is it that the information is coming into your body. And I think that by focusing on exceptional talent using methods that are already shown to be more robust, we can make faster advances than we have in the past. Because the old questions of the past are psychic phenomena generally true? Those questions have been addressed in great detail, and the answers are yes. But the secondary question is, well, if it's true in general, are there some people who are really good at it? And the answer there is also yes. And then you can start using people like that to actually learn something about what's going on.
Well, the problem is with consciousness is that it's absolutely obvious to each and every one of us that we are conscious experiencing beings. We all have different experiences, but it's absolutely obvious we are conscious. And for modern science, there's absolutely no way of accounting for consciousness. There's nothing in physics that predicts consciousness. So consciousness is a true anomaly in the sense in which Thomas Kuhn used the idea. There's no way of denying it and no way of explaining it. And normally what one does with an anomaly is first of all ignore it and then try to explain it in the existing paradigm. And in a way that's what happened with light, with the speed of light, that in the late 19th century various experiments showed that however fast you moved, you could never catch up with speed of light even by a fraction of a percent. Even if you were travelling at what seemed to be 9/10 the speed of light, light would still travel past you at 100% the speed of light. So all observers always measure the speed of light to be the same, which is a paradox. It shouldn't be that way. It should be different, the speed of light, depending upon your relative motion. So for example, if I'm driving a car and you pass with another car 10 miles an hour faster, I see you going 10 miles an hour faster. So there's a relative motion. The speed of light seemed to be absolute. And they tried to explain that within the existing model, and they couldn't do. So what Einstein said was, let's accept the anomaly. Let's accept that the speed of light is always exactly the same. Then how does physics look? And what he showed was that ordinary everyday physics, sort of physics we observe in this room, is exactly the same, and that's Newtonian physics. But when you start travelling very fast, then things are very, very different. Space is different, space contracts, time runs slower, mass gets heavier, and so he showed that space, time and mass are also not absolutes. They are dependent upon the motion of the observer. And what I'm suggesting is we need to do the same with consciousness. Rather than try to explain the anomaly of consciousness in terms of physics, is say, let's accept consciousness as what it seems to be. It's an undeniable fundamental aspect of existence, and see how that works through. And like with Einstein's shift, it doesn't actually change our existing physics at all. All of existing physics is basically the same. But what it does is open us up to a whole new understanding of what has traditionally been the exploration of mystics and spiritual adepts of one form or another who've really gone and explored consciousness. And there's actually an interesting parallel, another interesting parallel with Einstein. What Einstein showed is that time slows down and space contracts the faster you go. At the speed of light itself, time stops and space disappears, or distance disappears to be more accurate. Now physicists normally ignore that. They say because nothing can travel at the speed of light, we don't have to worry about the fact that time and space drop out the equations. And that's because mass also becomes infinite, and it will take an infinite amount of energy to drive an infinite mass, and since there's not an infinite amount of energy in the universe, we can't do that. However, light travels at the speed of light by definition. So from light's point of view, there is no space, there is no time, and there is no mass from light's point of view. It doesn't have any mass. And it's interesting, the same seems to be true of consciousness. Consciousness has no mass. And if you look at the writings of various yogis and things, when you're in a state of pure consciousness, without form, they describe it as one that's beyond time, beyond space. It's a timeless, spaceless experience. So I think there's interesting parallels here between consciousness and light. And also it's in our language. We talk about the light of consciousness, the inner light, the light that lighteth all minds. So I think what we need to do, just as Einstein accepted physical light as an absolute, I think we need to accept consciousness as an absolute, and then begin to look at how things pan out from that.
I mean, given that I know we have scientific support for the idea that the mind is much bigger than the ordinary physical constraints we place on it, that it's not as localized in space and time as we think, then why are we here? Now that's a big question, but one of my favorite theories, and it's not a really scientific theory yet because I don't know how to test it, but one that makes sense of it to me, is this is a training school. This is Cosmic Marine Corps boot camp or something like that. Being physically embodied gives us a focus, okay? I've worked with people who get into altered states of consciousness where they have very little contact with their body and they're sort of spread all over. And it's nice in a way, except if they want to do something, it's sort of vague as to how you do something. The physical world gives us practice in gaining leverage, as it were, in having some feedback about the consequences of our actions that I think can be used to develop our mind and spirit. Now that makes some sense of things to me. Whether it's ultimately true or not, I don't know.
Well, I have two different ways of thinking about what parapsychology says about awareness, self-reflective awareness. There's a large literature in parapsychology which suggests that conscious awareness is not necessary to have psychic effects occur. In which case, for example, the experiments I'm doing on the feeling of being stared at, or presentiment, which is a sense of intuitive hunch, but it's operating at an autonomic nervous system level. People don't have any conscious awareness at all that these effects are happening, and yet we can measure it in the body, objectively. So, to me, this kind of suggests that what we ordinarily think of as psychic phenomena, clairvoyance and telepathy and so on, are tips of the iceberg. It's the conscious, it's the self-aware experience of psychic phenomena, but the fact that it occurs in the body without any awareness at all, and in animals and even down to single cells, it suggests that we're dealing with something like the fabric of the universe. We're looking at ways of interconnections among living and non-living things, and that's what we call psychic because we don't have a very good name for it, a very good other name for it, perhaps. So in that respect, it's not clear to me that consciousness has anything to do with psychic phenomena at all. It sort of sounds funny, but that's one interpretation of what happens when you're dealing with unconscious psi. Now, in the other sense, if you limit yourself only to conscious awareness, what we know then is the way I think about this is, what does it say about the self, about that thing that is aware? And what it says is that among the properties of pure awareness, typically we know it through perception. If there wasn't any perception at all, we probably wouldn't, well, we may or may not be aware of awareness because it's perception turned on itself. So the act of perception allows us to get information which transcends time and space. You can be aware of things which are not where you are, or not where your body is. That probably then does say something about consciousness in which it's not located in the usual way, and it's not separated in the usual way either. So these are kind of two sides of the coin. Maybe they're complementary, maybe they're not, I don't know.
The possibilities are really almost endless because the capacity of this simulator is so vast. It's like the potential mathematics of the universe is just so malleable, so rich, and we take certain strands of it which may turn out to be Riemannian geometry or may turn out to be certain kinds of sets and things that we find useful to rationalize certain experiences from nature. It doesn't say that therefore it's true because it does, but you've got mathematics that fits and it's got some order to it. It's logical, it's lawful, it appears lawful. That's all wonderful. The capacity is there to do things beyond anything we imagine, and so if you want to set the thing up as a certain set of assumptions, then you have to have these other things because you have to have a picture that allows certain kinds of things. And then with future experiments, one will be able to discriminate between one versus the other, which is the more probable. I know when I first started going in science and doing things, I was able to come up with a dozen qualitative models to explain a finite set of experimental data. It was only when I made the transition to quantitative assessment of the models that I discriminate. And then the dozen probably dropped down to 2 or 3. And then it was necessary to design a very specific experiment to discriminate between these. That's the way it will be with this other. At this stage in time, It's good to have these various models. They're all possible. It's only experiments that are going to separate one from the other. And the experiments, though, are very much related to our consciousness. I mean, the research that we're doing experimentally shows that human intention can be treated as a thermodynamic parameter in physical reality, and we're getting very big effects. So it means you can change what appears to be physical reality. Well, that says, hey, boy, the physics is tied into our consciousness. I mean, the physics that's going to express itself is very much related to our consciousness. So now you can begin to see how these model building has to adjust to that as we become more and more awake. So our evolution, we're like a moving target, and we're riding on this thing we call the universe, in essence. So the science has to run fast to catch up in order to be able to describe what is happening and eventually get to the idea, perhaps, of seeing, oh boy, we're growing. We're growing so fast that we need better and better pictures, better and better understanding, etc. And so I suspect that's the kind of thing that will be happening as we unblock ourselves from the mindsets that we have. We have some pretty rigid mindsets. They're holding us back, but they won't hold us back forever.
Certainly quantum physics has produced such wonderful breakup of the materialist dogma, the deterministic, behaviorist, localist dogma. And non-locality is now becoming experimental fact in various parapsychology experiments, and also in our experiences of healing, in our psychological experience of love, which now can be studied in the laboratory to some extent. So this is very, very good progress, and we are making the progress so rapidly that we can really call it a paradigm shift, a kind of coming of a new age. It's happening so quickly, so rapidly, so almost as a miracle, overnight miracle, like the breaking up of the Berlin Wall. Of course, it's not that fast. The major component of it still is by the patient, slow workings of many individual scientists. But still, I think that there is a component of a new age coming.
Concept of mana. Mana is a concept of energy. Energy everywhere in Hawaiian. Every culture has it. Mana, prana, chi, call it what you will. Quantum physicists can talk about wave-particle duality, photon, whatever you want to say. I spoke at a major medical institution. 1,000 people jammed into the room. And I asked this question, how many of you believe in the invisible? And they're all shaking their heads. No, we don't. So I held up a test tube, let it drop to the stage, shatters. And I said, what caused that? And you all yell out, gravity. I said, how many in this room have seen gravity? None of them. I said, so we always start with the premise, you believe in the invisible. Now, who invented gravity? So they yell out, Newton. I said, he invented gravity, did he? No, he didn't. He gave a set of principles for an invisible thing that none of us really understand. It's just an explanatory model, and it works very, very well. That's what we're talking about. It is that simple. So when we say, as soon as we get this theory of everything, think how arrogant that is of us. As soon as we got everything, we will ascend. We have already ascended. We are already in this quantum heaven now. Why are we so busy trying to get there? That is our concern as Hawaiians. It is my concern as a psychoneuroimmunologist. It is my concern as someone who's been clinically dead 3 times. When I hear these theories of all these fancy explanations, I just want to back off and say, I already have a theory of everything. Doesn't that sound arrogant to say? It's get up, have a good day, live it up. That it sounds so simple, and it sounds so sophomoric. But Hawaiians have a statement that says, Ua olo loko ike aloha. It is love gives life within. And it is love. And we say it's very simple. And I think here's a theory of everything according to the ancient cultures and according to my science as a psychoneuroimmunologist. What do we know constitutes a real, joyful, connective, stress-free life? aloha. Alo meant to give, ha is breath, to share the sacred breath. Ha'ole in Hawaiian is somebody who's breathless. I had a guy run up to me the other day and say, Dr. Pearsall, this is in my island on Oahu. Where's the beach? I said, it's an island, man. Look around. Look around. Faster you run, more you go in circles. Well, I'm looking for this, looking for that. That's what scientists are doing. Looking, running around. Science and religion have already come together. They've already come together. Think of this. Maybe my last summary story. When I get hassles about our research on the heart remembering that the brain is simply resonating this energy all around us and we're part of this energy field, I said, I'll tell you more of a weird story. Once upon a time, on a little spot smaller than the dot at the end of a sentence, that little dot exploded. And it exploded into everything. And it accelerates at the speed of light, accelerating faster and faster through wormholes, black holes, universes, cosmos, everything exploding. And it's sooner or later going to come right back while we're struggling to explain the theory of everything, and it's going to implode on itself and we will vanish forever. What a weird fairy tale. That is the theory that scientists embrace for creation. They have no discomfort talking about black holes and spots exploding. But you talk to them about consciousness and they turn pale. That frightens them. Science, good science, and good spirituality are already one. Science and spirituality seek the truth. Scientism, or a philosophy of skepticism with cynicism, isn't good science anyway. In my work on spirituality, on out-of-the-box research, if you take a box like this and there's before life, reincarnation, afterlife, after-death experiences, outer space, the theories of abductions and so on, inner space, these are out-of-the-box, telepathic experiences. I'm finding that all of that research all comes to one point when you look at it, that we are indeed all one. Consciousness is that oneness. There's your theory of everything. You can still play with it if you wish, but it is as simple as that.